November 2nd, 1962. A dressing room at NBC Studios in Burbank, California. It was silent in a way that was almost violent. The kind of silence that comes after a scream has been torn from the throat. In that room stood two men who defined American laughter. Red Skelton, the beloved clown prince of television, his face a rudmap of comic genius, now drained of all culk. And across from him, Dean Martin, the king of cool, but the cool was gone. Replaced by something ancient, something feral, something that looked less like a man and more like a raw, exposed nerve. There was no laughter here, only the echo of a name that had just been spoken as a punchline, a dead man's name, Dean's dead brother. What happened in that room wasn't captured by the cameras. It wasn't written into any script. NBC would later sweep it from the official logs, and for decades, those who witnessed it would speak of it only in whispers, over locked doors and poured drinks. But the truth has a way of bleeding through the cracks of even the most carefully constructed facades. Because Dean Martin's response that night didn't just silence a joke. It shattered the myth of the man who made it, and it exposed a wound Hollywood had spent 30 years pretending didn't exist. And tonight, you will hear what was said. To understand the explosion, you have to go back to the source of the fire. Back to Steubenville, Ohio, 1917. The air wasn't filled with the scent of gardenias and champagne here. It was coal dust and steel mill smoke. Dino Pole Krusty was born into a world of hard edges and immigrant dreams. His father, Guttunner, a barber with hands rough from hard work and a heart scarred by a world that didn't understand him. And his mother, Angela. A woman whose love was as vast as the ocean she'd crossed, but whose spirit was slowly being crushed by the weight of a new land. But Dean wasn't alone. There was an older brother, William Alphonse Krusty, Bill, his protector, his confidant, his North Star in the chaotic Krusty household. While their father retreated into silence and their mother into the rituals of the old country, Bill was the bridge. He was the one who taught Dean how to throw a punch, how to talk to girls, how to navigate the treacherous streets of Steubenville where your name and your fists defined you. He was strength. He was safety. In the reflection of his brother's eyes, young Dino saw who he could become. The Martin family would later paint a picture of a happy, boisterous home, but the truth was fractured. Guttunner's pride was a brittle thing, easily wounded. He saw his son's olive skin, his dark features, and instead of seeing his heritage, he saw a target for the bigotry of 1920s America. He would scrub Dean's skin raw, trying to lighten it, trying to make him fit a mold that would never hold him. It was a quiet, devastating rejection that planted a seed of shame deep in the boy's soul. A shame only Bill seemed to understand. A shame that whispered to Dean, "You are not enough as you are." Then came the crash, not just the stock market in 1929, but the crash within the walls of 319 South 7th Street. Guttunner lost his barbershop. The family plunged into a poverty so deep it felt like drowning. And Dean, just 12 years old, watched the world he knew disintegrate. He watched his father break. He saw the light in his mother's eyes dim. But Bill got a job. Bill brought money home. Bill became, in every way that mattered, the man of the house. He was the anchor, the one thing holding their world together. Which is why what happened next was so unimaginable, so catastrophic, that it would rewrite Dean's DNA. 1930, Bill was just 23 years old, a young man, handsome, vital, the family's hope. He fell ill. The doctors called it tuberculosis, but in the tenements of Steubenville, they called it the wasting disease. It was a thief. It stole his breath, his strength, his future. And Dean, just 13, had a front-row seat to the slow, agonizing dismantling of his hero. The image is burned into history, though few understood its significance. A teenage Dean Martin sitting for a rare family portrait. He's wearing a suit that doesn't quite fit. And his eyes, they aren't looking at the camera. They're locked on something, someone just out of frame. According to a cousin who was there that day, he was looking at Bill, propped up in a chair, too weak to stand for the picture. Dean's expression isn't teenage boredom, it's terror. It's the look of a boy watching his universe collapse in slow motion. The end came on a cold morning. Dean was called into the bedroom. The smell of sickness and despair was a physical presence. He stood by the bed, took his brother's hand. Bill's final words to him, according to a family friend who heard the story from Angela years later, were simple. "Take care of Mom, Dino, you're the man now." then he was gone. The impact was geological. Gatuna, already broken by failure, was utterly destroyed by the loss of his firstborn son. He retreated into a permanent, impenetrable grief. Angela wrapped herself in the black shroud of a mourning mother, her heart forever in a grave beside her boy. And Dean was handed a mantle of responsibility he never asked for, over a family that was now just a collection of shattered pieces. He was 16, alone. The anchor was gone, and he was set adrift. This is the truth they buried under the tuxedos and the hit records. The foundation of Dean Martin wasn't built on charm. It was built on a fault line of loss. And every smile, every shrug, every seemingly effortless moment of cool was a conscious act of holding that fault line together. But remember that, because in a smoke-filled room 32 years later, that fault line would finally crack open. Dean fled Steubenville. He fled the ghost of his brother and the weight of his father's disappointment. He became a boxer, a card dealer, a speakeasy singer, anything to outrun the pain. And then he found a new brother, Jerry Lewis. The partnership was atomic. They were the biggest stars on the planet. But behind the manic laughter and the crooning, the dynamic was eerily, painfully familiar. Dean was the straight man, the anchor, the responsible one. Jerry was the chaotic, needy, brilliant child. Dean was, once again, playing the role of Bill, the caretaker, the protector, and he began to resent it. The breakup with Jerry in 1956 wasn't just a business divorce. It was a psychic amputation, and it left Dean untethered. He was a solo act now, but who was he? He dove into the Rat Pack, becoming the laid-back center of Frank Sinatra's chaotic universe. But that was just another family, another set of dependencies. He built a public persona so impenetrable they called it the Wall. The glass in his hand was always full. His smile was always easy. His demeanor was always unflappable. But the wall had cracks. Those close to him saw them. The endless working, the emotional distance from his own children, the way he could be in a room full of people and yet be completely, profoundly alone. He was performing Dean Martin 24 hours a day, and the only one who had ever seen the real Dino Crosty was lying in a Steubenville cemetery. This is the man who walked into NBC on that November day in 1962. A ghost in a tuxedo, haunted by a debt he could never repay to a brother he could never forget. And he was about to share a stage with a man whose entire life was about mining pain for laughter. Red Skelton, America's favorite clown. But clowns, as we know, are often the saddest people in the room. Skelton's own life was a tragedy worthy of Shakespeare. A father who died before he was born, a childhood in poverty, a beloved son who died of leukemia at age 9. Red channeled all that agony into his art. His comedy was physical, vulnerable, rooted in pathos. He felt everything deeply, which makes what happened next so inexplicable, so unforgivable. The show that night was a special, a variety extravaganza. The energy was high-wire, chaotic. Dean was filming his own series, *The Dean Martin Show*, on the same lot. He was tired. The pressure of maintaining the wall was taking its toll. Skelton, meanwhile, was in his element, the ringmaster of madness. During a rehearsal break, in the crowded, noisy hallway outside the soundstage, a moment of attempted camaraderie turned lethal. Witnesses recall the scene. Skelton, surrounded by writers and NBC brass, holding court. Dean, leaning against a wall, sipping from a paper cup, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. Skelton trying to draw him in, to break through that famous wall. And then, he reached for the one tool he thought they had in common: family. He made a joke, a throwaway line meant to bond over shared immigrant backgrounds, but in the joke, he used the name Bill. He referenced Dean's dead brother, and he did it with a punchline. The air didn't just leave the hallway, it felt like it was sucked into a vacuum. A production assistant who was there said it was the most profound silence she had ever experienced. You could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing, she said. Everyone just froze. Dean didn't move, he didn't speak. He slowly placed his paper cup on a nearby cable spool. The liquid inside didn't even ripple. His eyes, usually half-lidded and amused, were now black and bottomless. He looked at Skelton, but he wasn't seeing the comedian. He was seeing a grave in Ohio. He was hearing a final, ragged breath. He was 13 years old again. This was the moment Hollywood panicked, because everyone in that hallway knew two things. They had just witnessed a crime against a man's soul, and they had no idea what the sentence would be. Without a word, Dean turned and walked toward his private dressing room. He didn't slam the door. He closed it with a soft, definitive asterisk click asterisk. That click was louder than any explosion. Skelton stood in the hallway, his face crumbling. The joke had died on his lips, and now he was watching his own reputation begin to die around him. He had committed the one unpardonable sin in Dean Martin's world. He had used the sacred for the profane. A producer, trembling, approached Skelton. "Red, you have to go in there. You have to apologize." What happened next in that dressing room is the secret that stayed buried for decades, until a retired NBC stage manager on his deathbed decided he couldn't take it to his grave. The stage manager, whose name we've agreed to withhold, gave this account to a trusted journalist in 2001. He was the one sent to escort a shaking Red Skelton to Dean's door. He stood outside, ready to intervene if voices were raised. But there were no voices. He heard Skelton's timid knock. He heard the door open, and then nothing, for a full minute, just silence. He peered through the slight crack in the door. Dean Martin was standing by his dressing table, his back to the door. He wasn't looking in the mirror. He was staring at a small, framed photograph he kept tucked away, face down, during shows. The stage manager could only see the back of the frame. Red Skelton, the man who commanded stages in front of millions, was standing in the middle of the room like a chastised schoolboy. His hands were clasped in front of him. He was crying, not performative tears, but the silent, shuddering tears of a man who has seen the abyss he's created. Finally, Dean spoke. His voice wasn't the familiar, velvet baritone. It was low, flat, stripped of all effect. It was the voice of Steubenville. "You said his name." That was all, not a question, an indictment. Skelton tried to form words. "Dean, I didn't think, it was just a joke." "A joke," Dean repeated the word as if it was in a foreign language. He still hadn't turned around. "My father scrubbed my skin till it bled because he was ashamed of me. My mother, she died a little every day after we buried him. I held his hand while he turned cold. You understand? I felt the life leave him, and you made a asterisk joke asterisk." The stage manager said the temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. Dean finally turned, and what the stage manager saw in his face, he said, he had never seen on any man before or since. It wasn't anger. It was a grief so vast, so consumptive that it was terrifying. "You get to go home tonight, Red. You get to hug your wife. You get to remember your boy, your son, with love. I have to live with a ghost every single day. A ghost who tells me I'm not enough, that I'll never be the man he was. And you used his name for a laugh." Then Dean did something that shattered Red Skelton. He walked over to him, not aggressively, slowly, deliberately, and he didn't shout, he whispered, "Get on your knees." This wasn't a threat of violence. This was a demand for an act of contrition so profound, so humiliating, it could only exist between two men who understood the currency of pain. And Red Skelton, he didn't hesitate. He sank to his knees on the cold linoleum floor. He wasn't kneeling to Dean Martin the star. He was kneeling to the ghost of Bill Crosty. He was kneeling to every ounce of suffering he had just trivialized. Dean looked down at the weeping clown. He didn't gloat. He didn't seem to take any pleasure in it. He just looked tired, impossibly tired. "Now you say his name," Dean whispered. "Say it like it's a prayer, not a punchline." Through sobs, Red Skelton whispered, "Bill, William Crosty, I'm sorry." Dean held the silence for a beat that felt like an eternity. Then he said, "You don't ever speak that name again. You don't think it. You don't even breathe it in my direction. Now get out." Skelton scrambled to his feet and fled. The performance that night went on. The show, as they say, must go on, but it was a performance haunted by two ghosts. Skelton's comedy that night had a desperate, almost manic edge to it. And Dean, when he performed his number, sang "Everybody Loves Somebody" with a smile on his face. But his eyes, if you looked closely, were a million miles away. They were in a sick room in 1930. Incident was never officially acknowledged. NBC brass threatened everyone involved with termination if they spoke of it. It became one of those infamous, open secrets of Hollywood, whispered about at parties, denied in press releases. Red Skelton was a changed man. Colleagues noted he became almost obsessively careful, fearful of offending, the spontaneous, mischievous spark in his comedy dummered. He had looked into the heart of a real tragedy and seen the cost of turning it into a commodity. He carried the weight of that kneeling apology for the rest of his life. And Dean, he built the wall even higher. He poured himself into his work, into the bottle, into the carefully curated image of indifference. But those who loved him, his daughter Donna, his close friends, knew the truth. The wound never healed. He would visit Bill's grave whenever he was back in Ohio, always alone. He would simply stand there, sometimes for an hour, in silent conversation with the only person who ever truly knew him. When his own son, Dean Pull, died in a plane crash in 1987, it was Bill's death all over again. The cycle of loss was complete. The anchor was gone, and this time there was no performance left in him to hide it. He retreated from the world, a prisoner of a grief that had begun 57 years earlier. So why tell this story now? Why excavate this painful, private moment? Because for decades, we bought the lie of effortless cool, the lie of the man who didn't care. Dean Martin cared more deeply than any of us could comprehend. His entire life was a monument to a love he lost at 16. Every joke, every song, every smirk was a flower placed on a grave no one else could see. Red Skelton's joke wasn't just in poor taste, it was a violation of a sacred trust, and Dean's response wasn't about ego or rage. It was the raw, unfiltered scream of a boy who had his heart carved out and was being asked to laugh about the scar. This is Hollywood Untold Files. We don't just recount gossip. We listen for the echoes in empty hallways. We look for the truth behind the smile that doesn't reach the eyes. If you're still here, you understand that some legends aren't made of glitter. They're forged in loss and cemented with a silence that speaks louder than any applause. The final irony, in seeking to make a connection through humor, Red Skelton revealed the unbridgeable chasm that separated Dean Martin from the world. He showed us that the man we thought was the life of the party was, in his soul, always the boy standing vigil at a deathbed. So the next time you hear "That's Amara," listen closer. Beneath the romance, you might just hear a whisper of a name that shaped a legend, doomed a clown, and taught us that the deepest wounds are the ones we spend a lifetime pretending don't exist. And they never spoke of it again.